$15 million. The number hung in the still, lavender-scented air of the small apartment, an alien figure that felt almost profane. At 81 years old, Eleanor Vance, a woman whose entire existence had been a quiet study in duty and thrift, had just won the state lottery. The numbers, the same 6, she had played every Friday for 40 years. The date she had met her late husband, Arthur, had finally, impossibly, aligned. She sat at her worn Formica kitchen table for a long time, the ticket trembling in her liver-spotted hands. The familiar sounds of Charleston rising from the street below, the clatter of the bakery truck, the distant cry of a seagull seemed muffled, as if she were suddenly submerged in deep water. Her first, only, and overwhelming instinct was to share the impossible joy. Her fingers, stiff with arthritis, dialed the number she knew better than her own. Her son, Marcus, picked up on the third ring. His voice, even through the receiver, was clipped and starched. "Mom, I'm in a meeting. Is it urgent?" Eleanor's heart, which had been hammering with a wild, youthful drumbeat, suddenly felt fragile, like a bird's egg. "Marcus, honey," she began, her voice thinner than she expected. Something wonderful has happened. I won the lottery." A beat of sterile silence. "How much?" The question was immediate, stripped of all warmth, a surgeon's inquiry. "The grand prize, Marcus, $15 million. The line went sepulchral. She could hear the faint, expensive hum of his high-rise office in Atlanta, the sound of filtered, refrigerated air. Then, his voice, flat and cold as a marble slab. "Mom, with all due respect, you're too old to enjoy that kind of money." The sentence, delivered with the clean, antiseptic precision of a businessman closing a depreciated account, didn't just break her heart. It extinguished a light that had stubbornly burned for 81 years. It was the sound of her entire life, every sacrifice, every lonely night scrubbing other people's floors, every meal skipped to pay for his college textbooks, every ounce of her youth poured into the foundation of his success, being audited, deemed irrelevant, and written off, obsolete. "We'll talk later, Marcus," she whispered, her own voice a dry rustle of leaves. She hung up the phone. She was alone. The wall clock ticked, each second a small, leaden hammer blow against the sudden, crushing silence. The coffee she had made in celebration sat untouched, a skin forming on its surface. He hadn't asked if she was okay. He hadn't gasped or laughed. He had, in a single breath, declared her obsolete and staked his claim. In that moment of profound, clarifying solitude, with the winning ticket that felt more like a judgment sitting on her table, Eleanor Vance made a decision. It was not a decision born of rage, but of a terrible, cold clarity. It was a decision no one, least of all her son, would ever see coming. That same night, her neighbor from across the hall, Mrs. Gable, a woman whose loyalty was as sharp as her tongue, knocked on the door, her faded floral housecoat flapping. "Eleanor, I saw the commotion down at Sam's kiosk. The man is practically tap dancing on the sidewalk, telling everyone. Is it true? The whole jackpot?" Eleanor merely nodded, her eyes tired. The shock had passed, calcifying into a quiet, heavy resolve. Mrs. Gable bustled in, sitting at the table. "Well, bless the saints. And what did that high and mighty son of yours say?" "I bet he's booking a flight right now," he said. Eleanor paused, tasting the words again. "He said I'm too old to enjoy it." She delivered the line without emotion, a simple statement of fact. Mrs. Gable's face, usually animated, darkened. The air in the small kitchen seemed to chill. That ungrateful filth. She spat the word. "Eleanor, I am telling you as your friend. You do not give that man a single red cent. That money is yours. And if you're too old to enjoy it," she said, her voice dripping with a sudden protective scorn, "then you find someone who isn't. You hear me?" Eleanor didn't reply. Her gaze drifted to the small, silver-framed portrait of Arthur on the mantel. They had been happy, hadn't they? "Sometimes I wonder," she whispered, more to the photograph than to her friend, "if I failed him, if I loved him too much, if I erased myself so completely to build him up that he doesn't even see me anymore." "You didn't fail," Eleanor, Mrs. Gable said, her voice softening as she took her friend's hand. The contact was a shock of warmth. You finished. You raised him. Your job is done. It's time to live for yourself, or at least, for someone who actually values the air you breathe. Those words resonated in her chest long after Mrs. Gable left. Your job is done. For decades, her job had been Marcus. After Arthur passed suddenly, leaving her a widow at 45, Marcus became her singular focus. Her world, which had once been filled with simple joys dancing in the kitchen, walks by the Battery, shrank to the size of her son's ambitions. She sold her small home and moved into this apartment. She worked 3 jobs. She was a seamstress by day, her fingers gnarled from pushing a needle through heavy fabrics for the wealthy women of South of Broad. She was a cook by night, her hands perpetually smelling of onions and bleach from catering parties she could never attend. She scrubbed the floors of law offices downtown, the very same buildings her son would one day stride into, his shoes clicking with an authority she had paid for with her own knees. She had worn threadbare coats so he could have a new wool blazer for his university interviews. She had eaten broth and toast for dinner so he could have meat. He was her cathedral, the magnificent monument she had built with the mortar of her own life. And he had just looked upon his own creation, deemed its architect a ruin, and begun planning its demolition. She knew she wouldn't sleep. She walked to the dresser and took out the hardback notebook where she kept her meager household accounts. She opened it to a blank page. She took her blue ink pen and wrote, "Sometimes the saddest thing is not growing old. The saddest thing is realizing that for the one person you built your world around, you no longer exist." She put the pen down. A shadow crossed her mind. What if I just give it to him? The thought was a familiar one, the reflex of a lifetime of capitulation. What if I just do what he asks? An obedient, resigned mother. It would be easier. But as the thought formed, something else resisted. Something that came from the depths of her soul. A bedrock of dignity that had remained dormant for decades, compressed under the weight of duty, was finally, powerfully, pushing back. At dawn, as the first gray light filtered through the humid Charleston air, Eleanor Vance stood up. She walked to her closet and pulled out a small gray suitcase she hadn't used in over 20 years since a trip to see her sister in Pennsylvania. She packed 2 changes of clothes, her warmest robe, the silver-framed photograph of Arthur, and her checkbook. She left the apartment she had lived in for half her life. She did not lock the door. She did not look back. She took a city bus, the rattling vibration a comfort against the strange newness of her decision. She didn't go to the airport. She didn't go to a bank. She traveled across the Cooper River, away from the historic homes and into the sprawling, anonymous suburbs, and then further to a part of town Marcus had never, ever visited. The bus let her off on a cracked sidewalk in front of a rusty iron gate. The sign, its paint peeling in the salty air, read, "The Sparrow's Nest." It was a children's home, a place perpetually on the verge of closing, a place she and Arthur used to send small, $20 checks to every Christmas when they had a little extra. She had knitted blankets for them once, a dozen of them, years ago. She rang the bell. A moment later, Sarah, the director, a woman in her late 50s with the tired eyes of a warrior and a tense, kind face, opened the door. Her expression was one of confusion. "Eleanor? Eleanor Vance? Is everything all right?" "Hello, Sarah," Eleanor said, her voice surprisingly firm. "I need to talk to you. It's important." In that small, cluttered office that smelled of crayons, instant coffee, and industrial bleach, Eleanor laid out her new life. "I want to make a donation," she said. Sarah smiled, the kind of weary, polite smile that expected $50, maybe $100. "Eleanor, that's wonderful. Every little bit helps. You know how tight things are." $15 million, Eleanor said. Sarah's hand, which had been reaching for a pen, froze in midair. Her mouth opened slightly. I beg your pardon?" $15 million, Eleanor repeated. "All of it. I want the transfer made today. I want it to be completely anonymous. I want this place to never have to beg for funds again. I want the roof fixed before the rains come. I want scholarships for every child who wants to go to college. I want a full-time nurse, a therapist, and a kitchen stocked with fresh fruit and real milk. Sarah was white as a sheet, gripping the edge of her desk. Eleanor, I don't understand. This is a miracle. But your family? Your son? My son has been provided for, Eleanor said, the words clean and cold. This is not for him. But I have one condition. Anything, Sarah whispered, her eyes filling with tears. Anything at all. I want a room, Eleanor said. I don't need much. A cot, a window. I want to stay here. Stay here? As a resident? As staff, Eleanor corrected gently. I'm not here to retire. I'm here to work. I can cook. I can sew. I can rock the babies. I can mend the clothes. I'm strong. I need a purpose. And I need to be where this money is. Sarah stared at her for a long moment, seeing the iron dignity beneath the worn-out cardigan. She understood. You wouldn't be a blessing, Eleanor, Sarah said, her voice thick. You'd be an answer to a prayer. And so, Eleanor Vance vanished from the world that knew her. While the State Lottery Commission was besieged by press inquiries about the mysterious, anonymous winner, she was settling into a small, clean room at the back of the Sparrow's Nest. It was smaller than her old kitchen, with a single cot, a simple dresser, and a window that overlooked a patch of struggling grass. But as she unpacked her 2 blouses and placed Arthur's photo on the dresser, she felt something she hadn't felt in decades. She felt light. She felt a purpose that wasn't tied to the crushing, parasitic weight of her son's ambition. Her days found a new, quiet rhythm. She woke at dawn, not to the sound of Charleston traffic, but to the distant, chaotic sounds of children waking. She worked in the cavernous kitchen, peeling potatoes and stirring enormous pots of oatmeal. She sat in the laundry room, the warm smell of detergent enveloping her, as she mended torn blue jeans and reattached buttons. The repetitive, useful motion of the needle was a comfort, a return to herself. But mostly, she was drawn to the nursery. It was the quietest room, a place for the new arrivals, the ones still too small to understand their own abandonment. She would sit in the wooden rocker for hours, holding infants who had no one else, humming the old lullabies she had once sung to Marcus. It was there, in the quiet of the nursery, that she met Lily. Lily wasn't a baby. She was a wisp of a girl, perhaps 8 years old, with enormous, dark, haunted eyes that seemed to hold all the sorrow of the world. She never spoke, not a single word. She simply appeared, a ghost child, standing in doorways, watching Eleanor with a silent, unnerving intensity. The other children, with the instinctive radar of the young, gave her a wide berth. The staff, overworked and underfunded, treated her with a gentle, frustrated care. Sarah had told her the story. Found wandering near the highway 2 years prior, no records, no name on her lips. They called her Lily. Eleanor didn't press her. She didn't coo or ask questions, as the new volunteers did. She just sat. One afternoon, while Eleanor was in the small, overgrown garden, weeding a patch of stubborn grass, Lily approached. She sat on the far end of a stone bench, 10 feet away. They sat in the humid afternoon air, in total silence, for almost an hour. The next day, Lily sat a little closer, close enough that Eleanor could see a small, crescent-shaped scar on her temple. On the third day, Lily silently climbed onto the bench beside Eleanor, unfolded her small, bird-like legs, and leaned her head of tangled hair against Eleanor's arm. The contact was electric. Lily smelled of soap and something indefinably sad, like dust. She closed her eyes and, in the safety of that silence, fell asleep. Eleanor felt a fierce, primal wave of protectiveness she hadn't felt since Marcus was a small boy and had fallen from a tree. She stopped weeding and just sat, immobile, her arm cradling the sleeping girl as the sun dipped low, painting the sky in shades of violet and rose. She had been at the shelter for 3 weeks. The transfer was complete. The roofers were already hammering overhead. For the first time, Eleanor was writing in her notebook not with sorrow, but with contentment. The storm broke on a Tuesday. Sarah found her in the kitchen, her hands deep in bread dough. "Eleanor," Sarah said, her voice tight with an anxiety Eleanor hadn't heard before. "There are visitors. For you. They're in my office." Eleanor wiped her hands on her apron, a cold knot forming in her stomach. She knew. She walked down the hall, the echo of her own footsteps sounding unnaturally loud. She pushed open the door to the office. There he stood. Marcus. He was not alone. He was flanked by two men in severe, dark suits, carrying expensive leather briefcases. His face, when he saw her in the simple apron, was a mask of incandescent rage, barely controlled. "Mom," he said, and the word was an insult. "What is this? What is this place? What in God's name have you done?" "I'm volunteering, Marcus," Eleanor said calmly, surprised at the steadiness of her own voice. "Volunteering," he sneered, the word dissolving in his mouth. "We've been looking for you for weeks. We thought you'd been kidnapped. We thought you were dead." His eyes scanned the small, peeling office. This is worse. The bank finally confirmed an anomalous transfer. $15 million, Mom, $15 million. To this. He gestured around the room as if it were a leper colony. "It was my money, Marcus, to do with as I wished." "You are 81 years old," he hissed, stepping so close she could smell his expensive cologne. "You are clearly not of sound mind. You were manipulated. You were coerced by these people, this failing institution. You are confused, Mother, deeply confused." "I have never been less confused in my entire life." One of the lawyers, a man with a face like a closed fist, stepped forward. He placed a thick sheaf of papers on Sarah's desk with a heavy thud. "Mrs. Vance," he said, his voice slick, "I am Mr. Harrison, your son's legal counsel. We are here to serve you with this petition. We are filing for an emergency conservatorship of your estate on the grounds of diminished mental capacity and undue influence." The legal jargon was a smokescreen for the naked brutality of the act. He was trying to have her declared insane. "He's going to reverse the donation, Mom," Marcus said, his voice dropping to the cold, reasonable tone he used to close deals. The rage was gone, replaced by chilling pragmatism. "Mr. Harrison is going to fix this. We'll get you a nice place. A comfortable facility in Atlanta, near me, where you can be properly looked after. This performance ends now." "No, Marcus," Eleanor said, the floor seeming to drop away beneath her. "You don't have a choice," he yelled, the facade cracking again, revealing the raw, entitled fury beneath. "Do you think I will stand by and let you throw away our inheritance on these gutter snipes?" "It was never your inheritance," Eleanor whispered, the words finally landing. "It was my life, and you already spent that." "We'll see you in court, Mother," Marcus spat. The words were a curse. He and his legal team turned, a phalanx of dark suits, and stormed out, leaving a vortex of silence in their wake. Sarah, who had been watching from the doorway, pale and shaking, rushed to her. "Eleanor, my God, he can't do this." "He can try," Eleanor said, sinking into Sarah's chair. She felt old. For the first time since she had arrived, she felt every one of her 81 years. That night, she couldn't sleep. The court date was set for the end of the week, an emergency hearing. She would be forced to stand before a judge and prove she was not senile, all because she had given away money her son already considered his. She felt a profound, bottomless despair. What if they won? What if they dragged her away from this place? What would happen to the children? What would happen to Lily? She needed something. Proof. She needed to show the judge this wasn't a whim. She thought of the old checks she and Arthur had sent. There must be records. She went to the small, damp storage room in the basement, a place where the shelter kept decades of forgotten donations, boxes of things left behind by children who had aged out, or, more grimly, who hadn't made it. She was looking for old financial ledgers from the 80 seconds and 90 seconds, anything that might have Arthur's name, some proof of their long-standing connection. She pulled a heavy cardboard box from the back shelf, marked Personal Effects, Donations, 1,980 seconds. Dust plumed in the single bare bulb's light. Inside, beneath musty clothes and a broken doll, was a leather-bound journal. It was heavy, its cover warped by time and humidity. The gilt initials on the cover were A.V. Arthur Vance. Her heart stopped. It was her husband's, a diary she never knew he kept. He must have donated a box of his old office things years ago, and this was mixed in by mistake. She sat on the cold concrete floor, her hands trembling so hard she could barely open it. She took it back to her room. She opened it. Arthur's familiar, elegant script filled the pages. It started as she expected. Notes about his work at the shipping firm, frustrations with his boss, pride in a 6-year-old Marcus's first t-ball game. But then, it changed. Her breath caught. October 14th, 1981. I did a terrible thing today. I have shattered my vows. I met someone, Matilda. She works in the filing room. It was a mistake, a moment of profound weakness and loneliness. I've ended it. I pray to God Eleanor never finds out. The guilt is, it is a stone in my gut. Eleanor felt the blood drain from her face. She felt sick. Arthur, her quiet, dependable Arthur. She read on, her world tilting, the words blurring through a sudden hot film of tears. January 22nd, 1982. Matilda found me at the office. She's pregnant. She says she will disappear, that she wants nothing from me, that she knows I am a married man. But she is keeping the child. I gave her what money I could, all our savings. I told Eleanor it was a bad investment. I am a liar. I have destroyed my life. I have destroyed Eleanor, the only person I have ever truly loved. Eleanor had to stop, gasping for air, a dry, ragged sound in the small room. She forced herself to continue, flipping through months, then years, of entries. The journal was filled with his guilt, his quiet love for her, his pride in Marcus's achievements, and then, a final, chilling entry from years later, 1999. May 5th. God help me. I saw her today. The girl, her name is Isabel. She is Matilda's daughter. She is my daughter. She's 18. She works as a temp downtown, in Marcus's new building. She is beautiful, and she looks lost. But that is not the horror. The horror is who I saw her with. Marcus, my son. He met her in the elevator. He brought her to a company event, introduced her as Izzy. He doesn't know. She doesn't know. They are seeing each other. I opened my mouth to speak, and nothing came out. What could I say? To tell him would be to confess my own sin, to destroy his image of me, to destroy Eleanor. I have locked two souls in a terrible, unknowable fate. I have done nothing. I am a coward. God forgive me. Eleanor dropped the diary. A strangled animal sound escaped her. Isabel, her husband's secret daughter. Marcus, her son and his half-sister. She began to shake violently, uncontrollably. The dates, the timeline. Marcus had a brief, intense, and passionate relationship years ago, before his current wife. He'd been heartbroken when the woman, Izzy, had vanished, apparently pregnant. He had told his mother it was for the best, that she was troubled. Eleanor, her mind racing, piecing together a timeline of unbearable horror, ran from her room, down the dark hall to the nursery. She stood over the cot, where Lily, the silent, ghost-eyed girl, was sleeping. Lily, the child who had been found wandering, abandoned 2 years ago. The child of Isabel, who was Arthur's daughter, and Marcus's lover. Oh God, Eleanor whispered, leaning against the wall, the world spinning into a vortex of black. Lily was not just a child she had bonded with. Lily was her granddaughter. And she was also her husband's granddaughter. The child was the innocent, living proof of an unknowing, catastrophic sin, born of Arthur's infidelity and his devastating, soul-destroying cowardice. The day of the hearing was cold and bright. The courtroom was sterile, smelling of floor wax and stale coffee. Eleanor sat at the respondent's table beside Sarah and a young, sharp-eyed pro bono lawyer the shelter had found. Across the aisle sat Marcus, flanked by the expensive reptilian Mr. Harrison. Marcus looked confident, his face set in an expression of concerned, dutiful sonship for the judge. He refused to look at his mother. The proceedings began. Harrison was smooth and brutal. He painted a picture of a sweet, confused, grieving old woman, overwhelmed by a sudden, disorienting windfall and preyed upon by a failing charity. He presented a paid psychiatrist who testified in soothing professional tones that Eleanor's decision to give away her entire fortune and move into an institutional setting demonstrated a severe, textbook lack of executive judgment and a detachment from reality consistent with early-onset senile dementia. Mrs. Vance is a danger to herself and her own financial well-being, Harrison concluded, his voice resonating with false sympathy. Mr. Vance is here only to protect her, to protect his family's legacy. The judge, a woman in her 60s with sharp, assessing eyes, turned to Eleanor. Mrs. Vance, you have heard the testimony. Do you have anything to say in your defense? Eleanor stood. The room was silent. She was no longer the trembling woman from the nursery. She was something else. A matriarch holding the terrible, cleansing truth of her family's sins. Your Honor, she said, her voice quiet but carrying with perfect clarity to every corner of the room. My son claims I am confused. He claims I am living in the past, grieving a husband dead for 20 years. He is wrong. It is he who is living in a past he does not and cannot understand. Marcus shifted, frowning at her tone. My son believes this hearing is about money. Eleanor continued, her voice gaining strength. He is wrong again. This is about a debt of silence and sin left unpaid by my late husband, Arthur Vance. She held up the worn, leather-bound diary. This is my husband's journal. He kept it hidden for 40 years. It was found, by chance, in a box of old donations he himself sent to the sparrow's nest, as if his guilt was trying to find its way home. In it, he confessed to an affair many years ago that produced a child, a daughter named Isabel. Marcus's lawyer shot to his feet. Objection! This is irrelevant, scandalous hearsay. It has no bearing on the petitioner's mental state. It has every bearing on my state of mind, Your Honor, Eleanor said, her voice rising, cutting through the lawyers. Please, let me finish. The judge, her eyes now locked on Eleanor, held up a hand. Overruled. Proceed, Mrs. Vance. My son, Eleanor said, her gaze finally finding Marcus's, who was staring at her, his face frozen in confusion. My son also knew a woman named Isabel, years ago, before he was married. He was in love with her. He called her Izzy. Marcus flinched, as if struck. He didn't know. He couldn't have known. That this woman, the woman he fell in love with, was his own half-sister. The color drained from Marcus's face. What are you talking about? He stammered, his voice a dry croak. That's a lie. You're sick. You're insane. Am I? Eleanor said, her voice heavy with a sorrow that was almost biblical. Arthur knew. He saw you together. He saw you at a company party, and he said nothing. He let it happen. He wrote it all right here. He wrote, I have locked 2 souls in a terrible, unknowable fate. I am a coward. He let his son commit a sin to protect his own secret. She looked at the judge, who was pale. Your Honor, that relationship, it produced a child, a little girl. That girl was born into a world of shame and secrets. Her mother, Isabel, who was herself broken by a life she never understood, eventually abandoned her. That child was found wandering near a highway. That child ended up at the sparrow's nest. Her name is Lily. Eleanor's voice broke, just for a second, but she mastered it. I found her, or she found me. I gave that $15 million to the shelter, not because I am senile, but because it is the only home my granddaughter has ever known. It is the only place in this world she has ever been safe. She turned, her body rigid, to face her son. His mouth was open, his face a mask of waxy, uncomprehending horror as the pieces of his life rearranged themselves into a monstrous shape. "You are not here to protect your legacy, Marcus," Eleanor said, the words falling like stones into the dead silence of the courtroom. "You are here trying to steal the only safe harbor your own daughter has in this world. You are not protecting me from my confusion. You are trying to silence the one person who knows the truth." She laid the diary on the table. "I am not confused. I am not incompetent. I am, for the first time in my life, doing exactly what needs to be done. The money is where it belongs. It is paying a debt. It is protecting the only legacy that matters, an innocent child." The courtroom was utterly silent. The judge stared at the diary, then at Marcus, whose entire being seemed to have collapsed inward. The judge cleared her throat, her voice strained. "The petition for conservatorship is, on all grounds, denied. The donation stands. This court finds Mrs. Vance to be more sound of mind than anyone else in this room. Case closed." The gavel cracked. It was over. Marcus didn't move. His expensive lawyers gathered their papers, avoiding his eyes, and scurried away. Eleanor and Sarah stood. As they walked out, they passed Marcus, still sitting, a man hollowed out by a truth he could never have imagined. He had lost the money. He had lost his mother. And he had just discovered and lost a daughter, all in the same terrible cleansing fire. Eleanor did not return to her old apartment. She returned to the Sparrow's Nest. The legal battle was over, but her true quiet work was just beginning. That evening, she sat on the stone bench in the garden, the place where Lily had first come to her. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of bruised purple and gold. She felt a small presence, a familiar weight. "Lily." The girl climbed up beside her, placing her small, thin hand on Eleanor's. She still had not spoken a word. Eleanor looked at this child, her granddaughter, the living, breathing testament to her family's deepest, darkest secrets. The money was gone. Her son was gone. The family she thought she had was a phantom, an illusion built on a coward's lie. But as she sat there, holding this small, silent hand, she didn't feel old. She didn't feel poor. She felt a profound, quiet, and terrible peace. The $15 million had not been for her to enjoy. It had been a tool, a key. It had been the price of the truth. It had bought her freedom from a son who saw her as a balance sheet, and it had delivered her to her final, most important purpose. She was not just Eleanor Vance, the old woman. She was the protector of the Sparrow's Nest. She was the guardian of Lily. The money was gone, but she had, at last, found something of infinite value. She had found what was owed.